Hey, thanks for listening. David Yakir here, and this is Yak About Today. And I've been thinking. I've been thinking about this broadcast and realized by your letters that some of you out there are unsure of what podcasting is and how it works. So I've invited one of my favorite podcasting gurus to the show. His name is Andrew Allemann, and he is the founder of podcastguests.com. It's a service that connects podcasters with guests for their shows. So over 13,000 people use this service to make connections to experts that can educate their podcast audience about a new topic. He also has his own podcast that he's been publishing for 5 years. So when we come back, it'll be Andrew Allemann. What's up, everybody? David Yakir here for iHeartRadio's Yak About Today. And if you're looking in the mirror and you're still seeing 25 and you think 46 to 64 were the best years to be born, then this is the place you want to be. So get up, get out, go to the gym, or go for a run, and listen to what we yak about today. As promised, I've got Andrew Allemann from podcastguests.com. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me on. Glad to be here.
So I got to say thank you again because Andrew, from my audience here, Andrew's been supplying us with some of the favorite guests that you've all been writing to me about, especially in the Florida market. And so I thought it was about time I started talking to the person who made my show possible. And at the same time, what I thought we'd do is the audience in the Florida markets are a more senior audience. And some of the questions I get from them, Andrew, are, okay, so podcasting is really happening and my children listen to podcasts. And, I have interests. How do I find them? And they get caught up in the technology of what they should use. Is it on my phone? Is it on my computer? Where is it? So where I thought I'd start, because you're my hero in this. Let's explain what the difference between podcasting and radio is.
Sure. Yeah, so I think of podcasting as kind of on-demand radio. So if you have a favorite show that you like to listen to, instead of having to tune in on the radio at a certain time, podcasting allows you to download that content and listen to it whenever you want. So I think the simplest way to think about that is on-demand radio.
So that's basically the difference. Do you find that podcasting also, if I'm right, and I think I am, is the fact that you can handle many more subject matter in podcasts that you can in the broadcast world.
Right.
And because you can appeal to niche audiences, and, it's interesting because I have a radio audience also as well as a podcast. I would say you can find niche talking. You can find naughty podcasts, we'll call it. You can find podcasts of, any subject.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because podcasts are on demand, you don't need a certain time slot on the radio. It's like unlimited radio stations. And so I look at it a lot like blogs. There's a blog for everything out there, right? Every imaginable topic. And podcasts are becoming the same thing. There aren't as many podcasts as there are blogs by a long shot, but anyone who has any particular interest can start a podcast and find an audience.
So I think people don't know how to find the content that they want. Something? I used to do a show called Yak About Tech, where we tried to explain in sort of simple terms. So we know podcasts are out there, one like this, and my audience can get this on the radio, and they're probably used to getting it on the radio at a very specific appointment time. But when they ask me, how do I listen to you later? And I explain to them that I do have the website up that's hosted by, one of the podcast hosting systems. And I give them a URL, and that's fine. They go onto their computer with a URL, or they go onto their phone. but they're not quite sure with these podcasting apps or, and
Right,
how do they
right.
select one? And how do they sort of, you can't speak to all of them, but you can give them a general idea of, how they work, so they can get the content they want, they can get the shows they want, they can line up the shows they want and listen to them on a regular basis. So why don't you explain to them how it works?
So discoverability is an issue with podcasts. It's not as simple as just going on Google and searching for a topic. And most people, I would say, are introduced to podcasts through the Apple Podcast app, which is installed on every iPhone. It's a purple icon that says podcasts. And from there, you can open up the app and you can search for various topics or shows that you're interested in. And then the nice thing about podcast apps on your phone is that you can subscribe to the podcast. So every time that Yak About Today is published, they automatically download that so they can listen to it when they're out on the road or somewhere else. Now, the challenge here is that the Apple Podcast app in particular, it's not very good at search. It just searches based on the on the headline, the title of the podcast. And so Yak About Today, for example, it doesn't say exactly what it's about. And so that's where the discoverability issue comes in. I use a couple other podcast apps as well, and you can search for these in the App Store. One of my favorites is called Overcast.
My favorite also.
Yeah, Overcast Weather. It's much easier to find things, to find shows based on the subject matter instead. And then you can subscribe to them. And again, you get those downloaded automatically every week when the show is published. So I would recommend looking at one of these third-party apps. Again, if you're on Android, you can also download any apps through there. Most of them are free as well. And that's a good way to organize your podcast listening and download them. Like you said, you can go to an actual website and listen on your computer, but I find that a lot of people like to listen to podcasts while they're doing something else, like going for a run, out on a walk, even mowing the lawn, something along those lines, maybe attending to the garden, that sort of thing.
I think the next question I have, which I think is the reason that I contacted you, is that I get asked often, can I do a podcast? Organizations, businesses. In our case, what's driving me is the fact that in our area, it's a very sort of fundraising area, I always call it. There's a fundraiser every night for really a worthy cause. And those worthy causes, like one of our environmental institutes, that type of thing, and they talk about the value of podcasting. And I'm not sure I actually answer them correctly, about why they should be in the podcasting field. Is it really just for a branding purpose to create awareness? But there are other possibilities. Tell me what you think. What do you think the benefits of podcasting would be to different organizations?
Right. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think a lot of people come into it with the wrong goals. But I would picture it like this. It's a long form media format, and there's not a whole lot of that out there, right? So blog posts are typically fairly short. Maybe, even news stories on radio news like NPR, they're very short. They're a minute or two. Podcasting is very long form. So you can get into an in-depth conversation with someone, really explore a topic with them that you can't do in other types of media. And so I think that's one of the key things to think about when you get into podcasting. The other thing, when I think about an organization, is it's not just about the audience that's listening to it. It's about the guests that you interview, the people you interview on that.
So, your specialty.
Yeah. And I think about it like on my podcast, a lot of times I'll interview the CEO of a publicly traded company. And if I just called them up and said, hey, I want to ask you some questions for 30 minutes. I want to learn more about a subject. They're probably gonna be like, okay, who's this? No. But if I say, I'd like for you to come on my podcast and share your story with my audience, then they get interested in it. And so it's a great way as an organization, say as a nonprofit, they could even invite some of their big donors on to talk about what they see in the community and why they support that organization. So there are a lot of opportunities there that aren't just about the audience, but it's about the person you're interviewing.
So when somebody's starting, I think a lot of people who want to start podcasts, or a lot of organizations that I talk to that want to start podcasts. In our case here in Indian River County, where our local it's a local station by that's an iHeart radio station. We have about I think I told you this off mic. We have about 40 hours of giving back to communities. Some people specialize an hour a week on veteran affairs. Some people specialize in mental health and community, that type of thing. And what we're trying to do, obviously, is push out that information. Some of it is really local, but there's a lot of information that's really would be appropriate for anybody that's listening. But people who are not hooked into a regular radio station, what does it take to start a podcast? I think there's three parts to this. What does it take to start a podcast? What do you need? That type of thing. How much does it cost to start a podcast? I mean, one of the typical answers there is all you need is your phone and your headphones, and the content is all right. And how many different ways do you see there to monetize a podcast? In other words, a lot of organizations think of podcasting as part of their marketing. And how do they monetize that? People aren't sure. How do commercials work in podcasts? That type of thing. Maybe you can sort of step us through creating it, the cost. How do you monetize all those things?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give a high level overview. If someone really wants to start a podcast, I'd recommend checking out the site schoolofpodcasting.com to really get into the nitty gritty. But from a cost perspective and what you need to start up, it's not much. So you need a decent microphone. And I know you and I have upgraded to better than decent here, but really you can go get a snowball microphone on Amazon for $40 or $50. And that's good enough to get started. You also need kind of a quiet place to do it. And one little hack that I like to use is a walk-in clothing closet, because the clothes just absorb a lot of the sound. And so that at that point, you have a decent setup to record a high quality audio show, not the highest, but high quality. And I usually record over Skype. You can also do it over Zoom and use recording software. Zoom, I believe, has it built in. But then you need a way to get that out to people. So first you need to edit it. And some people don't edit their podcasts, but I think it sounds a lot better if you do edit, especially if there are any noises in the background, that sort of thing. I actually outsource that part as well, just because I quickly realized it wasn't worth my time to figure out how to do all of that. So I use a third-party service that does that for me.
Maybe you can explain that third-party service. They're an editing service?
Yeah, so it's called podcastfasttrack.com. And basically every week when I finish my podcast, I send the files to them and any special instructions, and they go through and they listen minute by minute, second by second, and they fix any errors, they equalize the sound levels, they take care of everything basically to make me sound better than I really do, and the guest. And so that way we've got a clean, crisp show without, coughing in the background if the dog barks, that sort of thing. And so that's really helpful as well. Those services, generally speaking, I'd say expect to pay $1 per minute or so of audio. Maybe a little bit more now. It depends on the level of editing you want them to do and the length of your show. But if you're doing a show every week, you might expect to pay $400, $500 a month to have someone take care of that for you.
For a 30-minute show.
Yeah, for a 30 to 60-minute show, I would say. There's a lot of competition in that space, though, now. So you might be able to find people that do it for less. But the nice thing is I send the files off to them. They edit it, they upload it to my hosting account, which is the next thing I was going to mention, and everything is done for me. So the hosting account, there are actually some free podcast hosting services out there, but I use one called Libsyn. That's Libsyn. And you can go to Libsyn.com, and it's cheap. It starts at $5 a month to host your podcast. And a service like that then helps you get it distributed also to a lot of different services like Apple Podcasts. I personally recommend that you also have your own website that you syndicate it to and list all of your podcast episodes on. That obviously involves a little bit more on the tech side. And it's not required. You could go just get a Libsyn account and then use that to kind of feed, if you will, into the Apple Podcast app and some of these other apps that play podcasts. But I would say those are the minimum things that you need in order to start a podcast. And
go ahead.
So you had asked about cost.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mentioned $5 a month for your Libsyn account there. The microphone. Are you picking up the dog in the background?
I am, but it's fine.
Okay. The microphone is $40 or $50, and then that's enough to get started. One other thing I highly recommend people do is get some good podcast cover art. So it's kind of like the cover to your book. You wouldn't produce a great show and then have a bad cover. And so you might need to hire a graphic artist to do that. You can get an okay one for $25 or $50. You can get a great one for $300, $400.
Okay, we're going to take a break right now so I can tell you about our great sponsor and the advertisers that make this possible. So if you've been listening to Yak About today, then you know it is sponsored by New Vision Eye Center. And it means a lot to me because it makes the broadcast possible. But if you know me, then you know I wouldn't have a sponsor unless I thought they were the best and I could put my name behind them. Well, New Vision Eye Center in Vero Beach, Florida is that place. And all you have to do is meet Drs. Minotti, Reinauer, Tate, and O'Brien to know that you are in the best hands where your eyes are concerned. So go see New Vision Eye Center and tell them Yak from Yak About Today sent you, because I wouldn't trust my eyes to anyone else. We are back, and I'm here with Andrew Allemann from podcastguests.com. Okay, so here's the big question. Ready?
All right.
So the big thing is I've created it. It's great. Now what?
and is this the monetization question?
Oh, actually, no. Well, I think actually I had it in the wrong order. I think this is the socialized question to bring in listeners, which would lead to monetization. And the reason I talk about this is obviously the socialization of all content has been with us for the last 20, 25 years. You need a means to bring in listeners. And there are big strategies, obviously, and there are smaller strategies that work. Why don't you give it? I mean, you can't talk comprehensively to, an entire plan, but you can give people an idea of how they go about bringing in listeners.
Right. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with. So Libsyn, my host, put out some data earlier this year that said the mean number of downloads per episode, so effectively listeners, is about 200 per show. And so a lot of people hear that and they're like, "Ooh, that's not a lot." And so I'd say, first of all, you might need to change your perspective based on your niche. Having an audience of that size that you can speak to every week is actually pretty nice. But when it comes to growing that audience, I found that the most effective thing you can do is have great guests on your show and then be a guest on other shows. And when you think about it, so let's say you have a good guest on your show. Well, let's use this as an example. I'm on your show today. It obviously will be on radio, and then it'll be turned into a podcast as well. Once it's turned into a podcast, I'll tell my followers, my audience, about it on social media, my newsletter that goes out to close to 14,000 people. And so then those are people that, some of those people listen to the show, and some of them will be like, "Hey, I like this. I like the host. I'm going to subscribe in my podcast app and listen to future episodes." So that's how having a guest on your show benefits you and growing the audience. And then the other thing is to be a guest on other podcasts, because everyone who's listening to those podcasts is a podcast listener. They have an app on their phone or they listen on the computer. And so that's a way to kind of grow your audience. Unfortunately,
we've got 1 minute. I was just giving you a time signal. Go ahead.
So unfortunately, it's not as easy as writing a blog post and having Google pick it up because of some of those discoverability things I talked about. So it's really, you have to put some elbow grease into it and be a guest on other shows, have great people on your shows, and then do all the other things that you would do, like promoting it on social media.
Right. And of course, on the services like Libsyn, when you upload, it gives you the ability to tag. So there is some search capability in there. It's not great, but,
it's there, but yeah, it's not great.
It's not great. And of course, the last thing is monetization could work. I mean, depending on, actually, you gave a good example, and I'm going to try to do this in like 30 seconds. So monetization sometimes works on the number of people that you have listening, so it could be broad scope and you bring in many brands or whatever. But the example I think I like to give is you talked about 200 listeners. Those 200 listeners could be very important to a particular sponsor. And
right.
The perfect example I like to give, if your podcast is about rabbits and there's a pet shop that specializes in rabbit food, the fact that you have 200 people that are looking for the best rabbit food is automatically worthwhile to a sponsor or an advertiser.
That's exactly right. And podcast audiences are loyal. They appreciate what the host has to say. And the other thing I'd say is to look at monetization as more than just sponsorships. Think about the audience that you're able to talk to. And if you have a product or service that you can talk to about every podcast episode as well.
Andrew, I can't tell you what it means to me to have you on here. I hope we can do this again and actually pick out topics and subjects that may be, really relevant to our audience.
It's been my pleasure, and I'd enjoy coming back on.
Well, that's it for now. I'm David Yakir, and this is Yak About Today. And remember, we are all over the web and everywhere you get your podcast. And of course, you can begin with yakabouttoday.com. So I'll talk to you next week. Love, peace.
Get all that garbage outside. Or you don't go out Friday night. Yakety yak. Don't talk back. Don't you give me no dirty looks. Your father simply knows the cooks. Tell all your hooligan friends outside. You ain't got time to take a ride. Yakety yak. Don't talk back.